Welcome to Week 3, Chapter 6, Risk Management, Identifying and Assessing Risks. The learning objectives shown here include that we will define risk management, describe the techniques, explain how risk is assessed, and discuss the results of risk identification process. Introduction to Risk Management. Managing risk is one of the key responsibilities of every manager within the organization. It includes risk identification, risk assessment, risk appetite, and risk control. Each manager should always focus on reducing risk. However, note that InfoSec management has to lead the way and balance the trade-offs between utility and security when accepting risks. Note here again, with risk management, we refer back to the art of war. Sun Tzu said, "One who knows the enemy and knows himself will not be in danger in 100 battles." So breaking down that statement, knowing yourself, armed with self-knowledge, the organization can initiate an in-depth risk management program. In knowing the enemy, realize that risk is the enemy, and risk management is the process of discovering and assessing the risks to an organization's operations and determining how those risks can be controlled or mitigated. Accountability for risk management. All the communities of interest bear responsibility for management of risk, whether they're InfoSec, IT, or overall the management and user of an organization. In this figure, you can see the accountability for risk management process: preparing for risk management, identifying risk, assessing that risk, and defining the risk appetite. That's the amount of risk that you or your organization is willing to accept. Let's talk about risk identification. Risk identification begins with the process of self-examination. Remember to know yourself. Identification and prioritization of information assets. This step should be done without prejudging the value of each asset. Values will be assigned later in the process. Note the chart for organizational assets used in systems, broken into 3 columns: information system components, risk management components, and example risk management components. Identifying hardware, software, and network assets, whether automated or manual, the inventory process requires a certain amount of planning. In the inventory process, the attributes for the assets that you're going to track are important, but there is no defined set of information to put into a list. The ones shown here, name, asset tag, IP address, are typically used for your inventory tracking. Identifying people, procedures, and data assets. As these assets are identified, they should be recorded via a reliable data handling process like the one used for hardware and software. Here are suggested attributes for people, procedures, and data assets shown in each respective category. When classifying and categorizing information assets, some asset types, such as personnel, may require an alternative classification scheme that would identify the clearance needed to use the asset type. As each information asset is identified, categorized, and classified, a relative value must be assigned. Note here is a sample asset classification worksheet. It has a system name, the date evaluated, who evaluated it, information assets, the data classification, and the impact to profitability. When prioritizing or rank ordering information assets, remember this goal can be achieved by using a weighted table analysis. In the weighted factor analysis worksheet shown here, note the criterion 1, 2, and 3 with the weighted score at the end being calculated. Threat assessment. Any organization typically faces a wide variety of threats. If you assume that every threat can and will attack every information asset, then the project scope becomes too complex for you to deal with as the CISO. Identifying threats. Before threats can be assessed in the risk identification process, each threat must be further examined to determine its potential to affect the targeted information asset. Here's an example of threats to information security, such as espionage or trespass. We spoke about that in an earlier week. Human error or failure as well. Sabotage or vandalism. When assessing threats, the following can help you understand the various threats and potential effects on an information asset. As you assess the threats, you're able to give an answer to the options and the response percentage assigned. When prioritizing threats, the organization should list the categories of threats it faces, and then select categories that correspond to the questions of interest. A vulnerability assessment is important. This review leads to the creation of a list of vulnerabilities that remain potential risks to the organization. Note the vulnerability assessment of a DMZ router. The threat is identified and the possible vulnerability provided. The TVA worksheet. The prioritized list of assets and threats can be combined into a Threats, Vulnerabilities, Assets, TVA worksheet in preparation for the addition of vulnerability and control information during risk assessment. Here's a sample TVA spreadsheet. Risk assessment and risk appetite. Risk assessment assigns a risk rating or score to each specific vulnerability. When assessing risk, the goal is to develop a repeatable method to evaluate the relative risk of each of the vulnerabilities that have been identified and added to the list. Likelihood. It's an overall rating, a numerical value. Whatever rating system you employ for assessing likelihood, use professionalism, experience, and judgment to determine the rating, and use it consistently. Whenever possible, use external references for likelihood values, after reviewing and adjusting them for your specific circumstances. There are many risk estimate factors, but one method shown here uses that likelihood we spoke about, multiplied by the consequences, or level of impact, subtracting the percentage of risk mitigated by current controls, and adding the degree of uncertainty. The formula is shown at the bottom. Likelihood. NIST Special Publication 800 TAC 30, Rev 1, the Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments, recommends that vulnerabilities be assigned a likelihood rating between 0.1, low, and 1, high. When assessing potential impact on asset value or assessing the consequences, most commonly organizations will create multiple scenarios to better understand the potential loss of a successful attack using a worst case, most likely outcome approach. Remember, when assessing the percentage of risk mitigated by current controls, if a vulnerability is fully managed by an existing control, it can be set aside. Whereas when figuring or assessing uncertainty, remember that uncertainty is an estimate. It's made by the manager using their judgment and experience. When calculating risk determination, the resulting ranked list of risk ratings for the three vulnerabilities shown in the slide from Asset A and Asset B are calculated by multiplying the impact value by the likelihood, subtracting your current controls, and adding your uncertainty. Using Asset A as an example, impact value of 50 would be multiplied by the likelihood of 1. With no current controls, you subtract 0%, but add 10% as your assumptions and data are only 90% accurate. Now look at asset B. Asset B using the same formula. Can you figure it out? For vulnerability number 2, if you come up with a rating of 35, you're correct. In vulnerability 3, you should have rated as 12. Another approach to calculating risk based on likelihood is the likelihood and consequences rating from Australian and New Zealand Risk Management Standard 4360. Here you see the 4360 consequence levels for organizational threats. Note that here it's level, descriptor, and explanation, as well as risk level and consequences. Here are the likelihood levels for organizational threats. Again, your level, descriptor, and explanation. The resulting rankings can then be inserted into the TVA tables for use in risk assessment. Here you see the 4360 qualitative risk assessment matrix. When documenting the results of risk assessment, other than the items shown here on the slide, you should also remember that information about the controls that are already in place is collected. In this table of ranked vulnerability risk worksheet, note the columns are asset, asset impact, vulnerability, vulnerability likelihood, and the risk rating factor. Risk identification and assessment deliverables. You have a list of deliverables and the purpose of that deliverable. In assessing risk appetite, the organization may very well reach this point in the risk management process. Examine the documented residual risk and simply state, yes, we can live with that. And then document everything for the next risk management review cycle. According to KPMG, a well-defined risk appetite should include the following characteristics. Of note, acknowledges a willingness and capacity to take on the risk. Remember, risk appetite is the amount of risk your organization is willing to accept. If an administrator were asked, what level of attack, success, and loss are you willing to accept for a particular system? The answer would provide insight into the risk threshold for that system, as well as that for the data it stores and the processes. Again, that's your risk appetite. If the answer to the question was absolutely none, then the administrator would have a zero tolerance risk exposure for the system and would require the highest level of protection. As you review the summary, do note the questions provided for developing weighting criteria for information assets. Also remember that there are 12 general categories of threats to InfoSec, and that each threat must be examined during a threat assessment. Also, don't forget the Threat Vulnerability Asset Worksheet, or TVA worksheet, and that the goal of risk assessment is the assignment of risk rating or score that represents the relative risk for a specific vulnerability or specific information asset. Also, important to remember, risk appetite is simply the amount of risk you're willing to take or your organization is willing to take. This is the end of the Chapter 6 presentation for Week 3. There is still one more presentation to go through. I'll talk to you guys then. Bye.